Welcome, old viewers and new viewers, to another episode of The Dancing Negotiator with Dr. Cheryl Okoli, DHA. This is the show where you learn all about conflict and its resolution strategies, the what, the why, the when, the where, the who. Evidence-based frameworks I introduced as an example, my original 5 A's mnemonic of conflict resolution, which you can find in my book, available on Amazon and more shops. I like to reserve the third Friday of each month for story time, which is basically an analysis of a movie, book, drama, analyze what went wrong, what could have been done better as it pertains to conflict. And last but not least, the last Friday of each month is reserved to have a guest. Now, this guest might be an expert in conflict resolution or has something salient to add and share with us as it pertains to the theme of the month. So welcome to the month of July. The theme of this month is all about the generation gap theory and conflict in the workplace. So before we get into that a little bit, I just want to point out something to you and give honor where honor is due. You might notice I have an interesting outfit on, and some of you might say, I like it. And some might be thinking, wow, that's from the 70s or from the 60s. Well, if you had a latter thought, you're accurate. So this dress is actually older than myself. Yes, much older than myself. And the honor that I want to give is to my parents. So this year marked the 47th anniversary. Actually, June of last year was the 47th anniversary. Wedding anniversary. So you can imagine if I said this dress is much older than myself. So you can imagine my mom actually wore this dress. And it was this dress, well, I won't say this particular dress, but this is one of the dresses that my dad saw her wearing, and I guess his heart was smitten by her. So yes, it's amazing that I have carried it on throughout the generations. And here we are talking about the generation gap theory, albeit in the workplace. So without much ado, we're going to talk a little bit more about this and this as the generation gap theory, but it's interesting how certain thoughts and values are passed down from the generations, right? We even know how physical items, like for some parties, is like a family heirloom, right? Inheritances are passed down. Items of sentiments, like maybe a mom's favorite veil, is passed down. So in this case, my dad could not get himself to get rid of this dress. So you'd be like, why my dad? Well, my dad clutched onto it. As soon as he couldn't fit my mom, he clutched onto it. He shared the story with me. I was like, I think I can fit in it, but it's not really my style, but in honor of them, I will keep it. And then here we are today. I thought it would be very fitting to share it. So with not much ado, the generation gap theory, let us talk a little bit about the origins of it. But first of all, I want to ask some of you, have you even heard of this concept before, this theory before? Some people have, and some people, there are two schools of thought. Some people believe it's a myth, others think there's truth to it. What do I believe? I believe there is some truth to it. I think it's mainly stereotypical. I think there are exceptions to the rules, but at the end of it, I'll let you decide whether you believe it's truth or myth. But we will be going through some evidence-based material in terms of the research. So one thing I want to share with you first and foremost is I want to talk about where did it all originate from. So granted, there are different theories about generations out there from a sociological perspective. But the authors and researchers are like us to talk about as it pertains to the origin of the generation labels as we know it today are Strauss and How with an E, 1991. They wrote a book called Generations, The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069. So right there, that gives you a hint. They were Americans and they wrote a book specifically about the American generations. So let's pause there. I was under the impression that the generation gap theory, when I learned about it, which was about over a decade ago, that this was a theme and theory that was well known all around the world, regardless of continent. But a conversation I had early on this year made me realize that is not the case. And by quoting Strauss and Howe right there, it was specifically pointing to the Americans' culture. So what does that tell you and I? It tells us that certain parties that might reside, say, maybe South America, Africa, Europe, may not be privy to the generation gap theory. Or if they are, maybe they may use it differently. But the key is they may not be, depending on maybe what area of study they specialized in, and if it needed or required them to actually be aware of this theory. So very briefly, I had a conversation with a friend who the two of us have similar backgrounds in the sense that we're both born in Canada, but our childhood was not spent in Canada. We moved twice. So for her, she moved twice between Scotland and I believe Australia before coming back to Canada after she was born here. And for me, I was born here, moved to Nigeria for my childhood, moved to the Middle East, Qatar specifically for my teenage years, and then returned back to Canada. So why I share that background is that here we are having a conversation and I brought up the generation gap theory and she had no clue what I was talking about. At one point in time, it almost sounded like she thought I was really wrong and off. She's like, well, not such a thing exists. At least not where I grew up. So I say, wait a minute, but Europe is considered part of the first world. Why would she know about this? And that's when it got me thinking, wait a minute. As I've always said, if you've been listening to my episodes, and I highly recommend you listen to my previous episodes, I always say it's wise for all of us to not assume that when you talk about a theory, a framework, or a topic in general, you might think it's common language and that your listener is aware of what reference points you're coming from. Do not assume that. So in this case, it was very clear the individual was not aware of generation gap theory, and I had to kind of like educate, but I saw it was almost getting to a point of a little bit of bone of contention. I was like, okay, it's not worth it. Sometimes it's best not to win an argument, just let it go. So I hope the individual went and researched it, not to say, oh, Cheryl was right, but no, to widen her knowledge pool and perhaps to experiment and see if there is any truth in this theory. So coming back to Strauss and Howe, they were Americans. They wrote a book. And basically, that's when we began to see the labels as we know them today of the different 5 generations according to generation gap theory. Now, this was according to a source that I used, and the resource is based on from the National Academies, okay? So the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine 2020. And the title of the document was, Are Generation Categories Meaningful? Are generation categories meaningful distinctions for workforce management, okay? And it's published by the National Academies Press. So based on that resource, I found out about Strauss and Howe and about their documents, the book I mentioned to you, and now the different labels. So there are 5 generations: traditionalists, baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Generation Z. We will focus only on the first 2. Well, however, I want to talk a little bit more about Strauss and Howe. Why? Because they had very interesting perspective. Not many authors totally agree with their line of thinking. Some deemed their material not to be really, well, I won't say they weren't evidence-based, but they critically analyzed it because they felt that some of their conclusions were coming from certain case studies, but nevertheless, they had some value to share. As an example, they believe that a generation encompasses a span of 20 years. And they identified different personalities of different generations, believing that the previous generation, their predecessor, gives birth to what we see and the characteristics we see in a different generation and subsequently, kind of like a domino effect. So the 4 personalities they identified were the idealist, reactive, civic, and adaptive. This is just extra information. But coming back to the labels for the generation gap theory, when we hear about the traditionalists, what I think about is someone who likes traditions. These are the individuals born before 1945. We have the baby boomers. So the baby boomers, as the name implies, or you may not have caught on that, it's named after an event. These were the babies or individuals born post-World War II. There was a boom in the population, in the baby population for a period of time, and then shortly after that, it declined. Generation X, now this label of the generation gap theory of this particular generation were named, believe it or not, it became popular by a Canadian who was an author and artist by the name of Douglas Copeland, or you might say Copeland, based on how it's spelled. Why was it named Generation X? Well, apparently, according to him, this generation did not want to have a label. So instead of labeling them, they decided to put an X. What is that reminiscent of? Well, for me particularly, it was not mentioned in this resource, but for me, it made me think of back in the day, centuries ago, when some people were illiterate and they could not sign their names. When they're asked to sign, what did they sign? You got it, an X. So that's what came to mind when I thought about that. And then we have the fourth category of generation gap theory, which are the millennials. Now, millennials are named after an event again. And what is that event? Those born at the turn of the millennium, sometimes referred to as Generation Y. You might be like, why Y? Well, if their predecessors are X, going with alphabetical order, the next would be Y, and following Y would be Z, hence Generation Z. Now, depending on which author you study, different authors and researchers have a different name for Generation Z. As an example, some call them the post-millennials, which makes sense. Some call them the iGen. Not quite sure why, still haven't quite figured out why. And others call them the homelanders. But for the purpose of the theme of this month, we will refer to them as Generation Z. And just a friendly reminder that today we will be focusing only on the traditionalists and baby boomers. So now, when we talk about the baby boomers and the traditionalists, I would like to share my screen to show you a little bit of the cutoff years, because the next question most people will ask would be, what generation do I fall under? I think I know what generation I fall under in terms of the cutoff years, but sometimes I've seen different variations of it, and your observation will be accurate if you've been thinking that. And well, let's think about it. Let me share my screen, and as we're doing that, think about it. Why do you think different authors would have different variations of the generation gap theory? Well, number one, it tells us that these are not set in stone. Secondly, depending on the researcher, the year the research study was done, the cohort they assessed or interviewed, that would give an rationale as to why slight variations. So for example, so let me quickly explain this. So this resource I got, so basically it's talking about the relative age of workers, specifically in the United States in the year 2020. If you look at this far left corner, what do you see? So it's basically, my apologies, is basically on the far left column is talking about, so it's going from Generation Z to traditionalists in the reverse order of how I introduced them earlier. So under 25. So when you see the various columns, you see different authors and researchers, how they categorize the different generations. You see how they, when I enlarged out my screen, you see how they categorize them by year, by name, and by age, right? You see that right there. So again, today we're talking specifically about the traditionalists and the baby boomers. So without confusing you, well, traditionalists, I mentioned born before 1945. So we are going to be focusing at the very bottom of this table today, the first two bottoms, which are those born 35 years or older, traditionalists. And as you can see, none of these authors refer to them as traditionalists, but that's fine. Some sometimes refer to them as the silent generation. And then over here would be the baby boomers, okay? Now, the cutoff year I personally like to use are actually in line with this third column by Campbell, Twench, and Campbell 2017. So which would be, again, traditionalists would be those born 1945 or earlier. The baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964. So let me stop sharing my screen there, and then we will proceed a little bit more. So you'll be like, okay, that's nice to know about what the cutoff year is, but how does that help me in terms of my relationships in the workplace? Excellent question. So before we do that, what we're going to do a little bit now is we're going to kind of envision a scenario, okay? So wherever you are, feel free to close your eyes. Hope you have a pen and journal handy to jot down some thoughts, immediate thoughts that come to your mind. So envision this. Envision that a remote virtual workers, and these workers belong to management, they were in a managerial role. They've had a hiatus of over a year working remotely, and then all of a sudden, they're summoned back to work physically, face-to-face at work. Now, naturally, this has caused some angst amongst different managers that were summoned to come back to work. And angst, aka some conflict, and at this point in time, it's beginning to look a little bit destructive, but any destructive conflict can be changed to constructive conflict. But preferably, we do not want any conflict in any shape or form to go towards the arm of destructive conflict. And I'm sure you would agree with that. So this is the scenario. So given that there's angst and these managers actually belong in different categories of the generation gap theory, different cutoff years, how would you resolve this conflict? So let's say you are maybe an administrator or a consultant that's being consulted to address this scenario. How would you solve the situation? So keep that at the back of your mind, reflect on it, and we will proceed a little bit further. And what we'll be proceeding to do right now, we'll be talking a little bit about the composition of the generation gap theory in the workplace. So I found this resource again, and it is American, and it is talking about the composition of the different generations in the current workplace of the United States. This particular resource is taken from Purdue University Global. So since we're focusing only on the traditionalists and baby boomers, so according to this resource, believe it or not, some traditionalists are still in the workforce. And again, just as a background, these are individuals born between 1925 to 1945. So yes, they'll be 75 years and above. And they actually constitute about 2% of the employees in a workplace, or at least where this study was done, of the general population, sorry, I should say, of the American population. And what are their characteristics? Well, they are loyal, enjoy respect, and well, they're loyal and they enjoy respect for the fact that they are loyal. But how can you motivate them? And by that I mean is the key is with the different generations, one needs to be able to engage them, because when you think about it, and if you are a proponent of generation gap theory, they have different values, different opinions, perhaps different hobbies. Yes, there are exceptions to the rules, but we need to engage all of our employees regardless of generation, right? So by engaging them, it's to be helpful to know what motivates each party. Why? For employee retention, to enhance organization productivity, to enhance patient satisfaction or client satisfaction, depending on what workplace you work and who your client is, or whatever shape or form, whether you're a physical person, whether it's an entity or an organization, etc. Right? Some of the things that motivate this group are job titles, which makes sense given that respect is a big thing for them. And another, of course, is money. I just say, of course, but money, according to the literature, is one of the motivators. Now, one thing I also wanted to point out about the traditionalists, keep in mind that even though the majority of them are retired, they are not necessarily tired. I paused there to share a conversation that I had with a traditionalist, a male traditionalist. It doesn't matter that he's male, but I just thought I should paint a big picture. So perhaps maybe you can understand the trend of thought. So I was talking about the different generation gaps and how conflict happens, and perhaps it's because of the generation gap theory. The person's response right away was, no, it's not generation gap, it's a knowledge gap. So right there, I was like, wow, that's a little bit of an epiphany. Some might be like, well, that's critical. That is common sense. But is it really? So right there, I had the opportunity to explore that line of thinking, but I could see the person was coming from a bit of a contentious point of view, and I did not want to have that escalate to a point of conflict that it would go down the path of destructive conflict. So what did I do? I just smiled, nodded my head, and just kind of like packaged it away for a thought to ruminate, to think about, ponder over some more, and explore further. Another reason, the same individual I was talking to once upon a time said, even though they're retired, they're not tired. So that's where I came up with that, okay? Now, naturally too, given the state where they are in the age frame and physical capabilities and so forth, some of them, I don't want to stereotype anyone, but if you were to research that and from anecdotal experience, the traditionalists might be waning physically, but from a mental and cognitive perspective, there's quite a huge number who can still are very sharp. They're still willing to do some beneficial work, either to be mentors of others, coaches, you name it, to share their expertise, right? So my question to you will be, how can, perhaps for your team meetings in your workplace, how about you consciously have traditionalists, maybe during orientations, when you're having body systems orientations, maybe consciously pair up a traditionalist with a millennium or a traditionalist with a Generation Z. Why? Because they can learn from each other. And what about for your social building, for your team building activities, right? How about you have the traditionalists who are loyal and love respect? How about they reintroduce some of those social graces that are beginning to dwindle away? You ask, what are those? As an example, chivalry. Basic, standing up when a woman enters the room. Yes, I know, please let's not get into this. There are some feminists who do not want men to rise up when they enter a room or open the doors for them. But nevertheless, there's a whole bulk who still love that, opening the car door, opening the door. These are social graces that help, in my humble opinion, and the research have shown, integrate society a little bit more in terms of interpersonal relationships, fostering that, right? What about the traditionalists teaching the social graces of etiquette at the dining table, the right position of where you place your cutleries, elbows off the table, things like that. You might be like, this is not relevant to the workplace, but it's relevant for enhancing rapport. It may not directly affect the workplace, but outside of the workplace, your employee is a human being that's holistic, that has a social domain, right? So just food for thought. Now, in terms of the baby boomers, when you think about the baby boomers, so there's a huge spectrum, if you will. 1946, there's the individuals born between 1946 and 1964. So some authors have actually categorized them into two, as in the young baby boomers and the older baby boomers. So how can you engage this? How can you motivate them? What are some of the characteristics they're known for? So this particular population, some of the characteristics they're known for are, they are also known to be loyal. They're very work-centric, they're ambitious. One author said you're cynical, and I'm still kind of like scratching my head upon that one. And when I talk about work-centric, that makes sense. I mean, think about their parents were the traditionalists, right? It's all about traditional. The Great Depression, World War II happened, and baby boomers are post-World War II, right? So some, going back in history, sadly, lots of men were lost in the war. The women had to step in and start working. So their children saw their mothers or whoever became their parent working really hard. So it would make sense that they're very work-centric. Some of the motivators for them are monetary and non-monetary in nature. So the non-monetary has to do with things to do with like maybe a retirement pension or some recognition that's non-monetary, okay? Now, I want to share something with you again on the screen. And what I want to share with you has to do with the different characteristics in terms of positions and the way the traditionalists, well, not so much the traditionalists, but the baby boomers, based on this research that I found, the different ways they interact and their working style, if you will, in the workplace. So this is basically showing, it's a resource that I saw. I saw an article, somebody named Cheryl Okoli. It sounds very Irish, so I hope I'm pronouncing that, shared with us. And basically it showed how, sorry, I'm not sure if you can see this yet while I'm enlarging my screen there. Let's see, sorry, I'll get the right screen. There we go. So right here, so baby boomers, sadly, I was kind of disappointed you didn't enclose the traditionalist point of view here, but in terms of baby boomers, just for today's episode, look at here. So the blue, so it shows that about 66% of executives are baby boomers. In terms of tech savviness, they fall lower than all the other generations. Baby boomers fall behind the Gen X when it comes to generation of revenue. They fall behind in relation building as compared to the other generations. In terms of adaptability, they scored lowest, minus Generation Z. This does not show Generation X and traditionalists, but they fall behind in terms of Generation X and millennials in terms of being adaptable. This next point surprised me, that in terms of problem solving, that Generation X apparently do better in that regards. They are, however, very cost effective as it pertains to, as compared to other generations. And last but not least, they're not very good at collaborating. So again, these are just, I don't want to say stereotypes. One could say they are stereotypes, but my point in just bringing that up is that they're exception to the rules, right? There are always exceptions to the rules. So next, going back to that case study scenario, and I see we have about 4 minutes left for today, this first half of this episode. What ways can we resolve that conflict of that scenario of individuals having conflict that they have to come back to work after hiatus of working remotely? And they all belong to the different generation gap theory, and they are managers. So I'll highly recommend, the first thing one can do is, again, take or leave it, but there are some suggestions. Have a singular template of the generation gap theory with the different age cutoffs, with the characteristics of each generation and the motivators in a public place, maybe a staff room, or however form, if you don't have a physical working space, incorporated somehow virtually, that all employees of a particular organization has access to. It will help foster interpersonal collaboration, understanding, hopefully help mitigate or eliminate, or you can never eliminate conflict, but mitigate conflict that could spiral down to destructive conflict. Have one singular template that has all of the generations there. So what I'll advise the administrator or consultant who's been invited to provide input to resolve that conflict is, it'll be fun, interesting to see what the generations, what motivates each generation, okay? I would summon a team meeting, again, either physically or virtually, verify and assume what the angst is, what the conflict is. But by having that template already, I've already prepared what it is could be the driving motivators. Now, granted, what I shared with you earlier is not all encompassing, but that is a good start. Next, I'll be consulting with HR just to make sure we're not breaching any union agreements or any other potential contractual agreements. But most importantly, have one-on-ones with each of the parties involved, because we should never assume that a template or research will speak to the specific individual needs of your employee. The key is try to meet them where they are, because the key is to enhance employee satisfaction without compromising client or patient care, safety, or operational functioning, or organizational productivity. So with that note, what is your call to action? The quick call to action for you is to reflect on these questions, and I ask you, how can you incorporate a member of the traditionalist in the workplace? How can you incorporate a baby boomer in the workplace? For the traditionalists, yes, either on a paid scale or volunteer, but how can you incorporate both the traditionalists and the baby boomers? Okay. If you have any questions, if you need help with change management for scenarios such as this, I invite you to contact me at Cheryl@shalomeagleswings.care or visit my website at www.shalomeagleswings.care. And I can help you from a consultant level or aspect of things, because I am a healthcare administration consultant. I'd like to invite you to join me same place, same time next week for another episode of the Dancing Negotiator with Dr. Cheryl Okoli, DHA, as we explore the remaining 3 of the generations. That these are Generation X, the millennials, and last but not least, Generation Z. But before we leave, I'd like to leave you with this thought as usual. Remember that you are needed in this world to be a solution. Be the best that you can, and do not rob the world of a precious gem, you. That's right, you are precious. Goodbye, and have a splendid day.